All right, folks, welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. I am delighted to have Meredith Kunz here, and she's going to be talking about Stoicism and parenting. So, delighted. Take it away, Meredith.
Thank you so very much. I appreciate the invitation to speak with you today. I'll be talking about how to apply Stoic ideas to parenting and a little bit about what to teach our children about Stoicism. So first of all, who am I and why am I here? My name is Meredith Kunz, and I am a writer, editor, blogger, mother of two daughters, a teenager and a preteen. And I'm raising with my husband here in Northern California. I live in the Bay Area. And in school, I trained to be a historian. I was always very interested in the history of ideas. And then I became a journalist to work on living ideas. And I also write a lot about research and how to translate complicated research into concepts that we can all understand and relate to how they affect us today. So I work right now in the field of communications. But for many years, I spent my free time learning about philosophy, spiritual traditions, and mindfulness. And then I discovered modern Stoicism in 2016. I'd actually read some articles by Massimo Pigliucci. I realized he has spoken with this group before, so I owe him that. And I actually derive most of my Stoic ideas from Epictetus, a Stoic thinker who was a former Roman slave and who became a great teacher in his time. And I get a lot of my Stoic inspiration from Marcus Aurelius, who's a Stoic Roman emperor. I'm sure you are aware of him and his meditations, which have inspired generations of people. And I've also delved into Seneca and some other primary sources. But as you probably know, most of the original Greek sources and explanations of Stoicism are lost today. So we're working with what we have. But luckily, there's also some really amazing modern interpreters of Stoicism today, such as Massimo, Donald Robertson, Greg Sadler, Bill Irvine, Sharon LaBelle, and Brittany Polat are some of the people who have inspired and informed me. And I know you've heard from some of them here too. I focus on applied Stoic life philosophy. I'm not an academic. I am interested in how it helps people live better and live in a more wise, brave, and free way. And often this is aspirational. You know, this is not something I can apply every moment of my day. I wouldn't claim to. The ancient Stoics like to say that, you know, it should be a goal to become the embodiment of this philosophy, which they would call a Stoic sage. I know I'm no sage, and it's possible there's never been one, but I still like to work on these ideas every day to try to help myself improve. Now I'd like to say a few words about what is Stoicism in a nutshell to me, my interpretation of kind of the key ideas of Stoicism broken down for you in a message in a bottle style summary. And then I'll get to my main topic. So first of all, in Stoicism, the key is to remember what you can and cannot control. But don't stop there. Take the time to discern the difference between these two things and then act on what is within your power. This is very important. Not being able to control an outcome does not mean that you cannot do something about a problem. You can act with a reserve clause. This was language that Marcus Aurelius pointed to. The reserve clause tells us that we may not always succeed in having an impact, but we can still do what's within our power to try to make a difference. I think this very much applies to when I with my children and working with other children as a volunteer teacher. So in any of our endeavors, we could go full speed ahead with what's in our control, even if things seem impossible to handle or to change. And then we just kind of have to steel ourselves to ignore or forget about the rest, the fear, the anger, guilt, frustration, put downs and insults from other people. So I try to remember, you know, this is my life, and doing what's within my power is the key to making it an excellent one. Also, we have to question our impressions. You may have heard this language before from other Stoic speakers. Really, what are impressions? They're the knee-jerk reactions that we have when we experience something in the world, and we all have them. So it's what we do with those reactions that determines our future and how we live our lives. if we could just kind of stop and think and tap into the inner spark of reason that the Stoics believe we all have inside of us, we can make better choices. We can make choices that aren't guided by anger, hate, fear, anxiety, what the Stoics thought of as the bad passions. So at every step, with everything we're about to say or do, it's very important to try to question it on some level. And of course, none of us can do this perfectly. As I said, it's hard to be a Stoic sage, but it's something to keep in mind every day. And this approach is reflected in modern cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. I'm sure you've heard about it. It's about questioning our misguided beliefs and our thoughts. And CBT derives many fundamental ideas from Stoicism. A tiny bit more about this topic. Because it's easy enough to say question it. Well, how do you question it? What are you questioning it based on? For me, that's really about the virtues. So ancient Stoicism had 4 virtues: wisdom, justice, courage, and moderation, or self-control. These are our yardsticks for how we're developing our character and for how we can live up to what's truly good in this world. So with each action and behavior, we can try to ask ourselves, does it meet the standards of the Stoic virtues? Is it wise? Is it just? Is it brave? Does it demonstrate moderation and self-control? And we can all work on kind of our moral progress in this regard. The virtues also could be described as a form of excellence. Arete was a word in Greek that was used for this. And they are the skills and character that we need to kind of attain well-being or happiness in our lives. Choice is very important here. I mentioned about things that you can and can't control. In Epictetus, the concept of choice is really fundamental to everything. And so what is in our control are the things we can choose. So if we can make these more virtuous choices, we can approach an overall moral good. I like this quote from Epictetus. Read it to my kids. It's kind of a funny one. You yourself are neither flesh nor hair, but choice. And if you render that beautiful, then you yourself will be beautiful. And in our age of constant YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram, maybe we should all be telling our teenagers this. This is a good message. Another key theme of Stoicism, kind of access your connection to your own nature, the nature of other humans, and the nature of the world. You've probably heard of living in accord with nature as a Stoic goal. It's a little confusing, but I think it means that for ancient Stoics, it was living in sync with our own human nature. And that includes heeding that spark of reason that's inside each human. It's this kind of special quality that we have, this guiding center, or Marcus Aurelius referred to the inner genius. It's something that we can get that's inside of us if we go through this kind of Stoic analysis in these steps. And also connecting with and helping with other people. Other people are viewed in Stoicism as our brothers and sisters. This is our common humanity that we share with all humans. So, we have to kind of recognize that bond and that social nature of humanity. I would like to add that this does not mean accepting unjust or unwise actions. Those things we can tell they're not morally good. And we can notice that some people are separated from their reason. They're separated from making good choices and from human excellence. So one thing we can do is try to be a good role model and try to model that ourselves. And also, as I said, try to work on the things we can change and that we can impact to make the world a better place. So Stoicism, I don't think, says just disconnect. There's a lot of things we can still do. Last one on this is make peace with mortality. This is very difficult in our society because we worship youth and we hide death. But if we can work on acknowledging that we are mortals, that there's a beginning, a middle, and an end to our lives, I believe we can live more in the moment and with less anxiety about our trajectory through life and its eventual end. So that's my message in a bottle, Stoicism. Now I'm going to talk about how can we apply these Stoic ideas to being a parent. So I'll take you back a few years to when I first became a mother. As I said, my older daughter is now a teenager. She's 14. It's very interesting because I think one of the defining experiences of becoming a parent is a loss of control. Even when I first became pregnant, I realized my body was doing things that I had zero power over. And it just, wow, the body kind of takes over and you're very much aware that this is not something you can manage or control. And then when my first daughter was born and then my second daughter, I quickly realized my children were really unique human beings. Each of them had personalities and behaviors that seemed inborn that were quite different one from another, even though they're only 2 years apart in age. They acted in ways I couldn't organize. I couldn't keep them to a schedule. You'll read parenting books that will say, have a proper schedule for your baby. And, none of that was really possible. And when I tried really hard to manage their behaviors, kind of their resistance to that grew worse. And I think it became clear this was not possible. The anxiety inside me really started to increase. I became overwhelmed. I wanted to be a perfect mother. I became super worried about mistakes I might make. And I got so irritable that I felt my ability to make good decisions in general was faltering. So I did stop and think about this. And I'd been practicing mindfulness and things, but I just started to realize I had this terrible fear of mistakes that could traumatize my children, that could help them, that wouldn't help them develop a good future or a good character. And that also that others would judge me or my parenting and how the world would judge my children. And it's a lot of pressure. And I would say that is one of the hallmarks of today's parents, unfortunately. We feel an enormous amount of pressure about all those things from our society and from the culture. We absorb that. I'll also add that in the service of what we think is, what's best for our children, quote unquote, parents today they're tempted to go to very outrageous lengths. If you look at the recent college admissions scandal, you'll see just one example of parents, trying to pay tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars to gain their child admittance into a school that they wouldn't have normally been admitted to. As a parent, I've felt the desire to control my children's lives and to pave the way for them to succeed, though luckily never using illegal means. But nevertheless, I've realized that it's really an impossible task, and it's misguided. So ultimately, I had to find a way to handle all of this and to deal with the worries and try to stop falling into this trap of feeling I had to control everything, or else feeling frustrated and annoyed and angry that I couldn't. And that pathway is Stoicism. And modern Stoicism has helped me personally enormously. I feel that it's helped me become a less anxious, less stressed person, and a more present and accepting and brave parent. And that is why I recommend it to all parents. I'm sure some of my friends are a little tired of hearing about it, but I think that it can help us feel liberated from the pressure and the guilt and the frustration that we have at not being able to perfectly shape our children, or not knowing how to guide them in some situations, or, realizing that we are imperfect people that can't always do the right thing 100% of the time, and the worries of how our kids will turn out and how that could reflect on us. So for me, it's not about giving up responsibility for our kids. Of course, as mothers and fathers, or in any situation, as grandparents, as aunts and uncles, there's responsibility and there's a sense of duty, but we can become more rational and less anxious. And we can give up some control to our children, especially as they get older. So in a practical sense, here's some ways that I approach this. First of all, with Stoic ideas, in that philosophy, other people's opinions just aren't that important. I didn't mention this in the intro, but I'm sure you've heard this before. It's really, that's viewed as just not something that you need to spend time worrying about in Stoicism, because what's important is our choices and the way we live up to our ideals and the way we strive towards the virtues. So as long as we as people are working on developing our faculty of choice, our moral sense, and making the best decisions we can in the situations that we're in, then we are good. We are being good role models for our kids. So I think part of this is seeing that, doing a Stoic analysis and seeing there's so many things outside of our control, but we're made to think they're in our control somehow. So we can apply this to so much. For example, the competition with other parents. I don't know, maybe it's also a function of where I live in Silicon Valley, but there's a lot of, discussion among parents about what the parents are doing for their kids and what they should be doing. And somehow parents who come up and tell me what colleges their kids have gotten into and so on. And so, there's always, some of that's just people sharing information, but sometimes it can be viewed in a very competitive light. So we need to stop and analyze that. Comparison with other kids, I'm sure there's always this temptation to say, oh, Joey's doing that, why can't you do that? There's always, this is, timeless, that parents will compare their children to other kids, or other parents will compare, or grandparents, or what have you. Sorry, one second. And the last one on this I have is this effort to do everything for our children. A lot of parents that I encounter seem to think that they really do need to sacrifice everything to be there in a way, kind of hovering over their children and helping their children and guiding their children and micromanaging their children. And that seems to be the norm for a number of people. First of all, it's not possible. And second of all, it's not good. And I'll get back to that. I'll circle back to why it's not good in a few moments. So I think accepting that our children are not really under our direct control, even though they are under our influence and guidance in a lot of ways, this is critical. They're not under our direct control. And it's the same with students if you're a teacher in a way. So Socrates had some bad students whose behavior was terrible and who went off the rails. And his response is, well, I don't control their minds. All I can do is provide a good role model. And sometimes it's in the hands of fate. This is kind of that acting with reserve clause. You do the best you can, but sometimes it's in the hands of fate. And if we can work on these limits and not get too frustrated with them, we still can balance that, I think, with our sense of responsibility towards our children. So again, Stoicism's helped me deal with the sort of social or societal pressures that parents face. And I think all parents could benefit from a dose of Stoic philosophy. And then we can work on the things that we can control, our own thoughts and emotions and actions, and motivating our kids. I've accepted more that I don't control my kids' behaviors, preferences, or interests. But I do hope that by role modeling this and by talking to my children about this philosophy and the way I choose to live my life, I'm hoping I'm setting them on a path of well-reasoned choices that will serve them into the future. I've learned a few things about kids that have helped me on this journey. So next I'd like to share a little bit about that. I think that we can help kids develop their character with Stoic ideals. I'm not talking about, turning kids into mini Stoics or mini Stoic sages. It's really more, I'd like to share kind of general thoughts on my philosophy as a parent, and then I'd like to talk about a few more practical ideas. A lot of parents today, I think, are tempted to express love through consumerism and entertainment for children. And of course, that's all surrounding us in our culture. And that's okay. But I think the ancient Stoics, they were a lot tougher on kids. They thought that characters instilled through exercise and sports and really hard work and, study, and they felt that we developed virtue through work. So I think today in a Stoic inspired life, it's important what we give children to do, rather than what we buy them. I'm sure that's a fairly obvious point, but I think if we're showing them what we care about through our actions as role models, and then try to give them or inspire them to do things that require some effort and require them to stop and consider what choices they're making and why they're making a choice to, for example, be brave or work towards fairness. Those things are really important. Just a few things with my own children. I'm one of the Girl Scout leaders, and both of my kids are Girl Scouts. So pre-COVID-19, I encourage them to do service projects. They worked on pedestrian safety, teen mental health, helping the homeless in our community, and also do kind of adventurous physical things. They, go on high ropes courses or 4 nights backpacking or rock climbing or sleeping under the stars for a week, things that are pretty outside their comfort zone. And on family vacations, do something challenging physically or intellectually or both. Like we did canyoneering together, and also I dragged my children to many, many museums. This is not their choice, but I do want to expose them to something that they can learn from that kind of gets them out of their regular comfort zone. And new challenges are really important. Research is showing us that keeping our kids perfectly protected from any adversity or any challenge is actually really harmful to them. In the long term, it can create potentially anxiety or even depression. There's been some interesting new writing about this. There was an article in The Atlantic called Childhood in an Anxious Age this spring. I thought had a really good summary of a lot of this newer research. It does talk about CBT, and it talks about another new form of therapy called space. And I think what was interesting about that is that they're talking about how parents' emotional and mental health impacts the children. We all know this, but a lot of times we just focus on the child's problem. Oh, this child is developing anxiety. How do we help him or her? I think there's 2 parts here. There's the parent and the child. My parenting philosophy is really focused on autonomy. I hope to raise independent adults. I don't believe in helicopter parenting, as I think you can tell. And I don't believe in intensive parenting, which is really another term for helicopter parenting. I wrote about this in the Modern Stoicism blog in April. And it's intuitive to me, but also it's clear in Stoicism. I think there's been studies showing one of the strongest predictors for motivation in kids and teens is a sense of control over their own choices. There's a very good book, actually I just mentioned it briefly. It's called The Self-Driven Child, by Stickstrud and Johnson. Oh, you probably can't see it because of my virtual background, but I can give you the title, The Self-Driven Child, The Science and Sense of Giving Your Kids More Control Over Their Lives. This is an excellent book. And they argue in the book that today's parents are depriving children of meaningful control over their lives. They're putting them at heightened risk of anxiety and depression by doing that. And they devote an entire chapter to how parents' mental health could be harming that of their children. They actually ask the parents to think about becoming a non-anxious presence for their kids and to stop micromanaging everything from their homework to their friendships. So I think that's key. Our kids are not performing monkeys here to do our bidding, and they're not the puppets of their parents. Parents shouldn't be orchestrating their every move. They're their own people, and they need to learn this. They actually need to learn to make choices and commitments. They have to figure out what motivates them and how to have good judgment over their priorities and how they spend their time. With teens, this is not easy. With young kids, it's not easy either. And I think now we're in a situation where, due to technology, due to a lot of social media, internet, a lot of available entertainment, gaming, there's actually many, many temptations for kids to spend their time not wisely. I'm not saying they can't do it, they shouldn't do it. My kids do it, but in moderation. It's all about moderation. It's exercising that virtue. But I think we're unfortunately in a situation where it is difficult for teens. So we do need to provide guidance for all kids, especially during the pandemic. Being home, not easy. Parents who work full-time, like my husband and myself, remotely, what are our kids doing? It's not simple. So I'm not trying to say this is easy. I just think it's something to keep in mind. Hopefully we can also be good role models to try to show kids and explain to kids the choices we make. I think one thing I remember my daughter saying is, she wanted to hear more about something my husband was choosing to do, or what he was doing with his time. I think devoting our time to actually explaining to our kids why we make a choice or how we arrive at a decision and spend our time on something is really critical. So we kind of have to treat them like adults in that sense too. My husband and I really try never to force our kids to do things. Of course, we don't want them to do anything dangerous or, that would really jeopardize their future, but we don't tell them, do this because I said so. The kids need to be able to really understand the reasoning behind things and start to work on accessing their own sense of reason, to be full people and to make commitments of their own choosing. Of course, we hope they'll commit to doing lots of household chores, which doesn't typically happen, but you never know. Maybe this thing will eventually sink in. So I'd like to also share a little bit more about how could you present Stoic ideas to children. With children who are very young, this is difficult, because their priorities are different. Their own immediate needs and wants are paramount. They're driven by play, by hunger, by fatigue, by competition with other kids, and so on. They haven't really learned to use their reason to understand cause and effect, to acknowledge other people's needs or wishes. But neuroscience studies show that from ages about 7 to 9, kids are laying down the structure for reasoning in their brains. So they grow this a lot at around age 13, typically when they're in middle school. I think that ages 9 to 10 could be a good time to introduce some Stoic or philosophical ideas more formally, kind of like the ones I shared in the beginning, that basic outline of the message in a bottle Stoicism. But at a younger age, we can already talk to kids about the things that are inside and outside of our control, about the consequences of our choices, and to question our impressions, that is our knee-jerk reactions to things. So I've said to my kids, stop, drop, and question your impressions. And even though it's a little bit more of a joke, it kind of has made something of a mark, so that they question impressions quite a bit, and they also question me and my husband's impressions to try to get us to think differently as well, which is interesting. Going back to when my kids were really small, so let's say if you have a toddler, kids who are 2 or 3, I remember one of my daughters had a lot of trouble leaving play dates. This is a major thing. Kids love their play dates, but they hate to leave. And some kids are much more flexible and they transition more easily in the lingo. But my daughter would get very upset about leaving her friend's house when the playtime was over. And she basically refused to do it. So she'd just sort of sit there and camp out. And so I tried a lot of different things, and I really started to explain the situation to her. I tried to help her understand other people's perspectives and the consequences of her actions. So here's kind of an example of that. I would tell her, well, your host, the family here has their own schedule. That's not in our control. They have to start cooking dinner now because, the rest of the family's coming home and they'll need to eat because they'll be hungry. So, you can't control that part, but what you can control is your response. You can change how you behave and how you react. And let's think ahead. Remember, if you don't leave when you're asked to go, you won't get invited here again. And that might be kind of sad for you because they would think you're not a good guest and they won't necessarily have you come back. And I think you'd like to come back again, right? And what if this were our house? What if we needed to make dinner? We can kind of giving them a sense of how they can change how they can respond based on a bigger picture that they might not be able to reflect on yet. But if you can kind of lay it out, I have found that sometimes I have success with that, and usually takes a lot of repetition, many explanations of this in a similar light, and then kind of helping them learn how to choose and how to give themselves better options in the future. Another example of this learning to choose, simple daily choices. Like I remember when my kids were that very small age, would you like to eat pears, apples, or blueberries? Limiting it to just 2 or 3 options. Would you like to play on the slide or the monkey bars? Would you like to go to the park or sit at this cafe? Those type of things. And the choice is very motivating to kids. And I think it helps them cultivate this faculty. It's not good if there's millions of choices, then they just become paralyzed. But if it can be limited to a smaller number of choices, I think it's really helpful. I also think it's good to show kids that there are natural consequences so they can start to gain wisdom on their own. And this is not an original idea or original to Stoicism, but I think it's again, part of living in accord with nature is you do something and there's a consequence to it. So for example, your child refuses to wear a jacket when going out and it's only 35 degrees outside. If she gets cold often enough from not taking a jacket, maybe she'll learn to remember her jacket next time, or at least respond when you remind her, bring a jacket. And sometimes you can spell out that trajectory too, kind of lay it out for them. If you don't wear this jacket, you'll get really cold and maybe you'll get chilled. You might get sick. That would be bad. And then you'd have to stay in bed all day by yourself instead of going out and playing with your friends and doing something more fun, or going to so-and-so's birthday party next weekend or something. So kind of reasoning it, helping them see how the reasoning can work has been helpful. It has had some success for me. And I'd say, you know, they can suffer those natural consequences too. My kids certainly have, you know, going out wearing flip-flops when it turns out they have to run in PE, or, you know, the jacket example. For these are just small examples, and these are very non-consequential. You could, of course, have much more serious consequences that would be very bad for your kids. So you do want to kind of help them work on the small stuff first, and maybe fail at the small stuff. You know, they forget their homework. You do not bring it to the class. You do not bring it to school. Okay, they get a 0 on that homework. But maybe over time, by the time, you know, if they do that enough, by the time they get to high school, maybe they'll get into habits of remembering for themselves. And that's kind of the hope. Another thing is sharing. This is a major topic for younger kids. How can we encourage them to share? The golden rule is very key in Stoicism, as in most ethical philosophies, reminding them to treat other people as we would want to be treated ourselves. And I think that helps them question the knee-jerk selfish impulse to keep everything for ourselves and to kind of just want to hold on to it. And reminding them also that other kids can get, you know, they can get joy when other kids will share with them, or when they share their toys and they play together. So not sharing isolates them, and they are very motivated also by their peers. In Stoicism, there's a concept of proto-passions. You may have heard this. Proto-passions are, you know, these involuntary emotional responses. I mean, there's a famous story of a Stoic thinker who was on a ship, and suddenly the ship starts rocking and storms are coming and the ship looks like it's going to go down. And so this guy turns white as a sheet and he looks like terrified. And they're like, you're not supposed to be scared. You're a Stoic philosopher. But in fact, you know, it's normal. It's involuntary. It's what you do after that whether it transforms into really truly a bad passion of, you know, enormous fear or anger, or whether you respond in a way that is more reasonable, more rational, and you can actually control it. And so immediately he was able to recover and act rationally. And I don't think his ship did go down in the end. But with kids, this is hard. We used to call it the red zone with our kids when they were young. We'd call it the red zone when they'd be in the bad passions, like, you know, anger, frustration, tantrums. Seneca said that anger is temporary madness. I know Donald Robertson has quoted this to me before. I think it's true that anger kind of takes over your brain once it gets far enough. And that point, it's not a teachable moment anymore. Kids need to just somehow you know, get themselves out of that mindset. And, you know, whether it's counting to 10, apparently Stoics used to say, count the Greek alphabet, which is more than 10, of course, take deep breaths, distance yourself. So these are kinds of advice we can give to our kids, but also to ourselves. I think when we're dealing with those tantrums and those situations of great frustration, when we're realizing we can't control it, but oh my gosh, I wish I could. And I think it's also not taking things too personally, both as a parent and as a kid, is very inherent in Stoicism. I'll just make this brief, but I personally sometimes tend to get competitive or get, you know, frustrated or self-righteous when I'm, let's say, even playing a game with my kids, and then they get frustrated. Why am I not winning? Well, why am I not winning? So I think, you know, we have to try to help them see the bigger picture again. You know, it's not necessarily unfair that you don't win this game. Maybe you just had bad luck. And that's how the world works. It's not personal. Begin to be able to float above it. You may have heard about the view from above. It's a Stoic meditation where you kind of rise above a situation and you look down and you think how small it is and how, in a way, insignificant, or how many other things there are in the world to think about instead of that one problem. So I have explained that to my kids as well. Same thing with if they're, you know, kids are bullying, or kids are, you know, in the playground or in the cyber playground. There's a lot of bullying these days. There's a lot of trolling, and my daughters have encountered it online, and it's heartbreaking. I mean, you know, my daughter, one person just literally made fun of her name, and she was just sad all night that someone was picking on her because of didn't like her name or something. I think that it's very important to try to get these messages across about not getting caught up in the insult. I'm sure that you may have heard Epictetus had a quote along the lines of, if someone says something bad about you, you can think, oh, he didn't know the half of it. We all have bad things about us, and we can try our best to ignore it. I've been part of an anti-bullying program called Project Cornerstone at elementary and middle schools locally, where we teach about this. And one thing is a whole book about fishing. These insults are like someone trying to fish for us, and don't take the bait. So that's kind of what we remind our kids. It's about perspective taking. And then just lastly, I'd like to go over a little bit about the Stoic Virtues and how we can try to teach this to kids while they're young. So again, the virtues are wisdom, justice, courage, and self-control. And naturally, there's a lot about these that are open to interpretation. But I still think that it's important to touch on this, because that's how we become better people in Stoicism. Wisdom, it's focused on seeing what's true and gaining a perspective on how things really work and our role in them. So I've actually been pretty impressed with my daughters around this one. They're able to cut through a lot of hype and see things pretty clearly and become truth tellers. And maybe it's because we do spend all this time trying to tell them our truths. I don't know, but they're certainly able to see through some of our flaws as parents. And I'm actually pretty proud of it, even though it's annoying at the time when I get called out on something, and I'm accepting of that. But I still go back to this one little quote from my daughter. She was a second grader. She came home from school, and I said, "What did you do at school today?" And she said, "Oh, we played ultimate team handball." I said, "Well, what's that? That sounds exciting." And my daughter turns to me and says, "It's mostly marketing." So the kind of attitude they bring, it's kind of like, they can see through stuff, which is, I think, actually good. Justice. As I mentioned, Girl Scouts, that's one of the ways that we try to do public service in our community and do these take action projects to help identify and solve problems locally. And I think that's important for them to think about globally too. We look at different organizations we can support. We look at different things we can even write about or talk to our friends about. My daughter and I went to a protest, things where we can try to express that we care about it, even though we know we don't have ultimate power to change everything, but we can still do our part to try our best to change it. And these are helping our human brothers and sisters, and common humanity in Stoicism is extremely important. I always mention that to my children. Courage, trying new things, and as girls, working against stereotypes. Both of my kids have done technology camp, they've done coding, and they're usually the only girl. But, and that they went to hackathon. Why am I the only girl, Mom? Well, I don't know, just keep going. To them, that feels intimidating. But I try to just kind of give them a little bit of, that's good. You're going for it. Maybe you'll inspire another girl to come next time. Something like the high ropes course. My daughter, she spent a while, she said, she's very scared of this at the top. But when she built up the courage, she was able to get it. She was able to actually go on the course, and she was happy. And then she did a survivalist camp called Gilligan's Island, where they get isolated and roll around in mud, and she came home completely dirty. And she loved it. She loved it. I think it was character building. These are small things. I'm sure many kids have much greater adversity and challenges, and I think those kids are building much more, I hope, of this character, and I think that's very important. And though I know this is not something that's the same for every family. Self-control, tough. As I mentioned before, there are many companies and technologies actually literally working to diminish our self-control, working to entice our teens and tweens and kids to stay online all day, to stay on apps all day. I think this is the hardest one for kids to live up to in a way. And I don't know, I think it's really, they should be allowed to do it, but they should have to sort of set their own limits. We've had them limit screen time. I've had my daughter come to me and say, I think you should change the limit to be shorter, which I was glad she said this, but even just allowing them to do it, but realizing balance the day with something productive. And delayed gratification. One thing we did with, their Halloween treats, we would take it away and put it on the top of the fridge and say, you need to at least ask when you want your Halloween treats. And they learn themselves to develop more self-control. It's hard during this lockdown because of remote learning. It takes a lot of motivation, but I think it's something that they can learn. And I also just want to mention, in light of this, that I do not think Stoicism is about suppressing emotions. This is something people ask me when it comes to kids. Oh, isn't it unhealthy to kids? You're telling them to suppress their emotions. You're telling them to be stoic. like Spock or something. First of all, we all know, I think Spock is not a good example of Stoicism as we practice it today or ever. And I think that it's not about suppressing emotions at all. It's about cultivating positive character attributes and virtues and finding joy and tranquility through better choices and devoting time to the right things. And it's, as I mentioned, that thing about the proto-passions, we can learn to recognize a negative emotion starting, and we can try to go in a different direction, make a different choice. It's not pushing things down that bother us. If you ever saw the Lego movie, and if you have kids my kids' age, you probably did, you might remember Unikitty. She suppresses all her negative emotions to stay super bubbly and positive and up until she realizes she can't anymore, and then she explodes with violent and destructive rage. I think that's quite true. We don't want to do this to our children. So we kind of work with them on the bad passions, CBT style questioning. And I've done this with my daughter when she would get very angry, and she learned this phrase of like not flipping her lid, literally like the lid of her head, it was just exploding. So that was a bad passion for her. And she realized, oh my gosh, okay, I can actually manage this better. Certainly it will happen. She will get angry, but she will learn, oh, I'm starting to flip my lid, and then somehow come back to being centered, get at the root of why is she angry? Why is she upset? Who's causing it? Can she change something instead of blaming someone else? There's so much there, and I won't go on too much, but the famous quote of, it's not what happens that upsets us, it's how we react to what happens. And kids can also grow a thicker skin when they start to think about, it's not, others' opinions do not give us worth as people. We are not dependent on our peers, on our parents to give us value. It's about our moral choices, and it's about our going towards these virtues. That can be really hard because we're living in this panopticon of online with, just even watching my daughter on Instagram. It's really somewhat scary. But I think if we keep repeating these Stoic principles, hopefully they can grow a bit of a thicker skin, and not suppressing, but putting energies in the right place. And I think also my very last comment is that ancient Stoics were not joyless. Stoic mindfulness reminds us to live in the present, to enjoy spending time with our children when they're young or any time, and to sample the banquet of life as it comes to us. That was a phrase that was used by Titus, I believe. It's super important not to let our anxieties and stresses obscure all the joys of having children in our lives. So I would still come back to that every time I start to get more frustrated and realize, okay, time to apply the principles, time to remember this. And one thing that has helped me is a handbook for new Stoics by Massimo and Gregory Lopez, which I think you know them here. That's quite a good book. So I will recommend that. And hopefully we can all keep working towards becoming Stoic sages. So thank you for listening.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Meredith. This was incredible. I thought I really liked that it came from kind of personal experience, and I was kind of blown away by your kind of initial observations that actually the amount and the intensity of loss of control when you become a parent. I mean, that's like it's and that's a very common phenomena. And your approach of dealing, kind of things like fear of mistakes, the social pressures, everything gets kind of more intensified and widened. So it was wonderful. So now let's go to question and answers. So we've got several questions lined up. We've got 4 rules. When you have questions, you can either raise your hand in Zoom, you can type exclamation mark, or type your question. Rule number 2, keep on topic. We're talking about Stoicism and parenting. Number 3, be brief. And number 4, feel free to disagree with anything anybody says, but do so courteously. All right, so it's going to be Dan, Gang, Sanjay, Joe, Deborah, Ed, and Keaton next. So when called upon, unmute yourself and ask your question and try to keep it brief. Dan, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Shrikant. Hi, Meredith. This is Dan. We've met on Twitter a couple times. I really liked your anti-bullying metaphor about fishing, or not giving into that. But my real question is about being a parent. A lot of times we talk about Stoicism as dealing with people that we don't live with, that we see sometimes. But as a parent, when you're immersed in the difficulties of children every day, did you find a certain part of your Stoic practice was improved significantly by doing that every day, that cycle, or maybe part of your practice that was tested?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would say parenting is really what motivated me to practice this every day. I think it is needed every day to remind ourselves of the core messages of Stoicism, because I think it's so easy to slip into this, oh, my kid did this, I have to somehow control that. I have to manage that. I have to manage this person, and I have to manage this relationship. So that's probably the biggest practice that I work on, not actively trying to come in and micromanage and tell, oh, you have to do this and you have to do that. And I think that goes against the grain of most modern parenting. So it's swimming upstream in a way, but I try to continuously recall that. And then also this issue about the red zone. I mean, I will witness my kids or other kids becoming really irate or very frustrated, and I try to give them the tools, and I also try to give myself the tools, because I remember my response is really important too. How am I going to role model this non-anxious presence of a parent? This is critical, and I think that as a country, we're not doing too well with that. So I would say those are the things that kind of inspire me to keep practicing Stoicism.
Jean, you're next.
Hi, this is a great topic. We were just talking about last night, and during the discussion, I said, I really think, school need, because a lot of people, we're not religious, and we don't really have a place for kids to learn this social moral skill. And so, and I studied Stoicism, and this is perfect for kids. And I just want to ask if there's there's any books, like more towards a kid they can really read. I have a 12 and 15 years old boys, and especially the 15-year-old. I recommend 12 rules and he won't even look at it. So I tried, and I really like how the kids really help us to grow, because I went to landmark training. I went all this training actually to help better to cope with my kids or motivate them, So this actually inspired me to learn more. I learned a lot. I'm not sure how to pass down to kids. So I want to learn more about this Stoicism with kids, yeah.
Yeah, it's a fantastic question, because this is something that's on my mind all the time. And people have asked me this, and there's a couple books for very young kids who are younger than yours that there's a fellow who's written a couple like little picture books for children with his daughter, I think. But actually, this is a topic I would like to write about. I've in fact started kind of a draft about how do we teach our kids this, or literally just a book for, a Stoic inspired life philosophy for teens. I would think this is really important and valuable. I don't know how many people would buy this book, but I feel that they need this toolkit just to navigate the world today, because it was bad enough when I was a kid and I went to a public high school that was quite competitive, and competitive university and so on. And I found it very stressful and very difficult, but I think that it's much worse now. So this is something I would actually like to work on. And hopefully if I get a chance to do that in my busy life, I'll share in the future. I do write a lot in my blog, The Stoic Mom, about how I try to talk to my kids about this. So that is a resource, but I do think we need more resources like this. I think, an older kid could read a Handbook for New Stoics, the book I mentioned. It's just that they might feel it's a little tough to apply, when they're younger, because it's pretty serious. So yeah, but thank you for asking about that, because it was interesting to me to know if people want this, because I feel like it would be helpful.
Next up is Sanjay. Sanjay, go ahead.
Yeah, hi. I have a question about co-parenting. So, you talked about helicopter parenting, and that's obviously a negative aspect of parenting. most parents think that there are a lot of problems out there that they have to save their children from. And most of them are not real problems, but there are some problems that are serious. For example, emotional harm that can leave impact on children for the rest of their lives. And I personally, I have two children, twins, who are young adults now. And so this is a personal issue that I went through that I learned firsthand. So when you talk about loss of control, this is something that I understand, but also loss of control takes many forms. So specifically, when you're co-parenting and you have a co-parent, your spouse or partner, and it can even be other people. It doesn't have to be co-parent. It could be grandparents even. If they're doing things that are harmful to your children, that can be a real problem. Especially if the type of harm that they're doing is subtle or not noticeable, or it's not easily demonstrable. A lot of times, things that parents do, they become apparent in children after years. So, I want to be a Stoic. So the approach I took is trying to understand this, but also seeing the inability to fix the harm that they did. So my question really is, how do you help your children after this has happened, after they've been harmed, let's say by the other parent, without really attacking that other parent? Because no child wants to see one parent attack their other parent. So how do you help your children in that situation?
That's very difficult. That's very difficult. I think one similar situation, I discovered that one of my daughters felt quite traumatized by a teacher she had. And I didn't know it at the time. I didn't realize at the time she was a young student and she, I guess, was scared to share about this. And later on, she told me what a negative impact that teacher had. And, that was someone she was in that classroom every day, all year. And I didn't realize how difficult it was for her. So I think this is tough. And I wouldn't say I really know the answer, but I do think that this process of CBT, the cognitive behavioral therapy, it's kind of going back and having them maybe having the child analyze what actually happened, what did I feel and think about what happened, how can I recognize, my motives are good. I mean, part of, I think it is that the kids maybe sometimes feel a sense of shame or sense of they did something terribly wrong that brought on this, or, I don't know the nature of the situation, but there's a lot of different emotions that get tangled up together. So the good thing about CBT is I think it helps us untangle somewhat, what actually happened, what our response was, what our response maybe would be now, or what would be a better response from us. And that goes back to this thing of, it's not so much the things that happen that harm us, but our ways of thinking about it. And I feel that's very hard with kids because they are vulnerable and they can be hurt. So it's a really difficult question. I would hope that maybe if the kids were able to go through this process of questioning what happened, figuring out what their role was, figuring out how they were harmed, and maybe they do have to keep some of that to themselves if they can't share all of that investigation with the other parent, but they can at least acknowledge that on their own and figure out what their mindset will be going forward. Another thing is I've found, if you have to let's say, be in a family with or work with toxic people, what we might call toxic people, or people who do try to harm us, there's a lot of methods in Stoicism for handling that. I just think that the kids would probably need a certain level of self-awareness and maturity to really grasp that. But, for example, there's a woman that I know where her family would come to visit and see her with her young son, and she got very upset because they would constantly be critiquing how she raised her son, or they would be saying these things that sounded saccharine and sweet, but in fact were made to be almost an insult about her. And so she would spend this time premeditating this adversity. This is a Stoic technique. I just don't know if kids can really do it, but as a parent or maybe as a young adult, they can, let's say they have to visit the toxic family member, they might need to spend that time premeditating. Okay, here's all the things she or he could say to me. here's how this is how I will probably initially feel. Here's my proto-passion. Here's my initial knee-jerk reaction or my impression. How am I going to shift that? How am I going to try to respond differently? How am I going to kind of almost steel myself and get my own courage to respond differently and think differently in response? That has helped her, but I don't know, how much that helps, but that's probably what I would say.
Thank you. Thank you, Meredith. So it's going to be Joe, Deborah, and Ed next. Joe, go ahead.
Hi, yeah, thank you so much for joining us here today. I learned a lot. Actually, Dan had taken my question, but I do have a follow-up to that, or to the previous question, actually. Some of my either coworkers, I don't have children myself, or even I do know kids where their parents are absent quite a bit. How would you engage them to identify with living a more virtuous life, and what would it be an effective way of maybe, doesn't have to be stoic because you don't want to just hand them like somebody handing a Bible to somebody, but you do want to just communicate to them the value of how virtue is its own reward, and how would you approach that?
Yes, and I want to do more thinking about this myself for teens, because as I mentioned, I hope to write more about that directed towards teens or preteens, because I think they have a lot to navigate. I do think it comes back to the basic messages of, there are things that are in control, there are things that are in our control. And if we really approach those from a point of view of being as excellent as we can be, then we create the best life possible for ourselves. And no matter what situation, people have applied Stoicism in prison, or when they're unfortunately, living as enslaved people or something like that. And so I think kind of pointing out some role models and examples can help. In the Stoic community now, there's some discussion of, Marcus Aurelius as a role model, but there can be other role models, maybe someone, like Gandhi or Rosa Parks or Martin Luther King. I know that sounds kind of unattainable, I think, to kids. I think this is one of the issues that I'm struggling with as I want to write more about this, is that, for example, my daughters are in Girl Scouts, and one of them wants to do a Gold Award, which is like an Eagle Scout for Girl Scouts. And the examples that are shown from the scouting organization are so incredibly impressive and perfect that it feels unattainable. So I think we need to find more ways to show how this is attainable. And that's why I go down to these very specific examples, like the example about leaving the play date, or about wearing a jacket, or just everyday life decisions. So, even in, my kids and I watched the movie Frozen 2, there was the song from the character Anna, where she says she's going to do the next right thing. Just do the next right thing. Next time you're confronted with a choice, think about it. What will be what will be more wise? What will be more, wise in the sense of doing what's true? What will be more just in the terms of doing what's fair? So maybe breaking down the virtues into specific examples of everyday life can be very beneficial. I think holding up really unattainable examples is maybe tough, but showing examples of other, small choices that we had to make. For me, it's also my personal experience. It's like, oh, I had to pick between this and that. This is how I chose, explaining that. But I do agree that sometimes it's hard to motivate the kids when there's something that's so much easier. It's easier to just not have self-control about video games and just play them all night because it's really fun. So, if they're able to set longer term goals for themselves, this is very critical. If they're able to say, oh, I know that I want to someday, do an internship in X, Y, and Z. Okay, I have to do these steps, breaking it down into steps. And then what's the next right thing on this path? That would be another suggestion I have.
Thank you, Meredith. Next one up is Deborah. Deborah, go ahead.
Hi there. What I wanted to say, I'm super impressed with everything you said, and I agree with everything. And I want to introduce myself. I'm a teacher, and I teach elementary school. And I wanted to ask you if you use the term power when you talk to your kids or any children that you are dealing with, because one thing I've noticed about my students is they feel like they don't have any power. So they don't have any power if they're in a difficult family, because I teach in an area that has a lot of gang activity. And so I want the kids to develop inner strength. So what I say to them is, you do have a ton of power. You have the power to choose what you think. You have the power to choose what you say. You have the power to choose what you do, how you react, and who you're friends with, and then I go on. So I was just wondering if you use that term, or, you know, I just wonder what you think about that. And I'm so excited about what you're talking about. It's giving me a lot of ideas.
Thank you, Deborah. I really appreciate that. And that's a great term, power. I think I should use it more. I usually use this term control because that's something I've gleaned from my readings of Stoicism. But I think power is in a way better, especially for kids in elementary school, because as you said, I do think they do feel sometimes that they can't change things and that they're just stuck there and that they have a lot of pressures on them and a lot of difficult situations they're dealing with. And I think giving them that power, this is the freedom of Stoicism. You're describing the freedom of Stoic thinking very well. So I think I'd like to start using that term more. Thank you for pointing it out. I love this, you know, the power to choose what you think, say, do. This is all within, as I said, even practicing Stoicism in the most adverse circumstances, we still have that power, even if our physical being can't go anywhere and is stuck in a cell, we still have that power. So that's really, well, it's empowering. So thank you.
Next up is Ed, Caton, and Scott. Ed, go ahead.
Yes. Hey, thank you, Meredith. I enjoyed the presentation. It was excellent. I think there's so many things that can be picked up. I'm exposed to a lot of millennials. I know my stepkids and my two nieces and my nephew. And what really disturbs me about millennials today is that I find that a lot of millennials have been brought, especially if they're brought up in upper middle class environments, that they're children of privilege, that they seem to, want things without, that they feel it's sort of their birthright. I also have a friend who is a real estate agent in Williamsburg section of Brooklyn, and he says that more than half of his clients that get apartments are what they call trust fund babies that really never worked. They expect their parents would usually buy the apartment or give them a down payment, and they're making $50,000 or $60,000 a year. They can't afford to live there, but their parents want them to have this. And I see that this is something that is very prevalent. There's also, among a lot of millennials, I sense a very thin skin. They're very easily offended. Like I'm, much older, late 60s, but I wasn't brought up like like that. I really, even though I don't have the thickest skin myself, I'm not nearly as easily offended as many of the millennials I deal with. And I sense that there has been some kind of a problem of upbringing, and I don't know how Stoicism can be dealt with as far as the millennials are concerned, but there is definitely, especially a class problem among millennials who feel that they are entitled because of their upbringing to have things, and how they, must learn, how to deal with others that, don't have that. And maybe they're given too much. I don't know, but there are issues. And I think a lot of other people see that too among the so-called millennial group.
Yeah, I think you're pointing out the effect of this helicopter parenting and this or they sometimes I think called bulldozer parenting, where it's literally smoothing the whole path ahead of the child. So the parent comes and is like, oh, I don't want there to be any adversity or any challenges or anything difficult for my child, because this is how I express my love to my child. This is how I help my child. So he or she just, everything gets bulldozed in front of the child. So everything is made, comfortable and easy, and look, I'm going to buy you this house or something. I mean, and of course, I'm sure that feels very, very nice at first. But I think, as I said, there's some new research that's showing that keeping our kids perfectly protected from any challenge is really harmful to them in some ways. And it can create anxiety for them when they have to deal with anything, or it can create situations where they become fixated on something that bothers them, and then they need someone to come and save them or rescue them or smooth that out for them. And I don't think that that's character building. So I feel that I like the idea that Stoic philosophy wants us to think about what we give our kids to do, rather than possessions, rather than consumer stuff, rather than making it easy for them. Let's have them work on things that help them develop their virtue. And I mean, believe me, there are a lot of times when my kids, they don't necessarily want to do those things, or they're either scared of doing it, or they would rather do something fun. And sometimes it requires a lot of conversations, but they're fortunate. They have a comfortable life. A lot of people don't even have that luxury. They don't have the ability to choose. They're in adversity. They're living in a challenge. And I hope that through this philosophy, though, we can use our mindset to try to build character, build strength, build that inner power. And that can also deal with a thin skin. I mean, it's very easy to have a thin skin when you haven't had any troubles in life and haven't had any adversity. It's, a lot harder when you've faced an uphill battle just to get where you were at. So I don't think there's anything we can do about the people who don't choose to follow this philosophy per se, but we can keep, hopefully maybe more people can realize that parenting our kids towards their own autonomy and raising independent adults who can understand how to face a challenge is a good thing. I mean, there's also a book that came out a few years ago called Grit, and it showed that the biggest predictor of success for students was grit, not, intelligence level or scores on a test. But you're talking about probably some people who do, if they already have a trust fund, well, I guess they're pre-successful. So they're untouched by certain things. But for average people, building that grit and that kind of ability to cope is really critical. And I imagine a lot of the people you're talking about may also have mental challenges if they haven't had to learn to cope, if they hadn't regulated their own emotions. Everything was regulated for them by somebody else. So yeah, I don't know. Let's hope the pendulum will swing in this direction.
Next, it's going to be Kaiten, Scott, and Mike. Kaiten, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for all of your insights. Very helpful. It seems like for the Stoic, exercise or whatever, it's more like a kind of, what do you call it, antecedent, meaning like a more proactive approach, like try to apply that to parenting going down the line. But let's say from the other end, let's say, a child, a teen or whatever, has made poor choices and not Stoic at all. And, as a non-anxious parental presence, how do you help them kind of realize, how to put it back on track, let's say, like say into a more going forward, more Stoic path,
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think some of that would depend on what the specific challenges or problems that the child has, or what you're hoping the child will decide to change about herself or himself. But I do think part of it can go back to what Deborah said about power, kind of reminding them that it's in their hands. They have the power to change. They have the power to think differently, speak differently, act differently. I think maybe it's a natural consequences situation too. If the consequence they're facing is kind of bad, perhaps they'll be able to employ this kind of thinking around their own choices and their own power. But again, I do think in Stoicism, we can't really force people to change, and there will be some students and some children that it's very difficult to kind of set them on the path. We can show the path as being a role model, and we can spell out what the consequences are, but we can't really make that choice for them. I hope, though, that by reiterating some of this, it's going to make some difference, some impact, so that even if they're in, you know, a very difficult situation, maybe they can still take back some of their own agency and really work to make a change. I mean, but they do, you know, like one example that some people cite is Marcus Aurelius, you know, succeeded by Commodus, one of his sons. And he was a terrible emperor. Marcus Aurelius was a great emperor. So I know that that's not very optimistic, but I do think that people do have a chance to change. And if they can somehow adopt a life philosophy, actually also it goes back to many young people don't really have a life philosophy at all. And maybe sometimes pointing out to them, you know, how are you actually making your choices? What is your guiding, you know, star? And if you could stop and think about, like, there's something called the values definition, I believe. I'm not sure that I'm getting that right, but there's values clarification. This values clarification exercise could be maybe very helpful, especially for teens or young adults, where they think about what are their values. So it goes to them, again, not to the parent. They talk about their values, and then they write down some of their values, and then they write down some of their behaviors, and they write down how, you know, what's the difference? What's the disconnect between what they're doing and how they're acting in the world and their own values? Because I think, you know, many people have good values, but they just don't act on them. So maybe a values clarification is another approach that I would consider trying.
Thank you, Meredith. Next up is Scott, Mike, and Zeno. Scott, go ahead.
Hi, Meredith. Thank you so much for this. It's been really valuable. I am pretty new to Stoicism, and so I'm trying to dig into it and understand it for myself, but then also try to use some of it in relating to my two teenage daughters. So it sounds like so much of what you're talking about is predicated on the ability to actually communicate with your children, which can be such a huge struggle, just getting past that one step of being able to give them suggestions of ways to deal with adversity or whatever. And I have found in my own dealings with my daughters that there's so much going on and they're both teenagers. So there's so much going on in their brains right now, in their hearts, in society pressures that they feel, everything else, that it's like there's these thunderstorms inside their bodies all the time. And that oftentimes then gets expressed at me or at their mother. And I personally have tried to this is, I guess, is more of a comment than a question, but I'd like your take on it, that in kind of trying to give them the thought of, say, not taking something quite so personally, which ties in, I think, with our opinions about what others think of us and all that stuff, that I've found that I need to turn the mirror on myself in those situations and remind myself not to take their reaction to me so personally, because in some ways they're right where they need to be developmentally in terms of them pushing back on me really hard, which doesn't always feel comfortable to me. But at the same time, they're becoming young adults and they're trying to figure out all this stuff, part of which means breaking away from the parents and all that stuff. Anyway, so I just am interested in your take on that. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. It's very interesting, and I think it rings true to me too. And I think you're right, that holding the mirror to ourselves, this is one part that I wrote from my talk because it was getting too long, about how we get angry with our kids as well. And I think we all have, I mean, even Marcus Aurelius said something along the lines of, we all have a child inside of us that reacts in ways that are childlike. And having that humility and that ability to relate at that level, to say, well, wow, I'm having this response, and it's kind of, I'm kind of being childlike in a way too, just like my daughter is doing. I think that is critical. And it's very hard because we always think as parents, we're supposed to know better and we're supposed to control our kids. Again, it goes back to those basic assumptions about how we parent our children. But I think you're on a really good path. And there's a lot of books that have come out recently about the teenage brain and about how teens need to go through this process of individualizing themselves, of separating themselves from what their family, does and says. And that's a very normal developmental process. We just want to try to give them the tools that they can use to do this in a healthy way so that they won't unfortunately go off the rails or really have a bad consequence towards them. Another thing I would say is the Stoic Mantra, here and now. It's similar in other traditions, but just the being in the moment. Because what happens to me sometimes in the situations you're describing is I will spiral into, oh my gosh, if she doesn't do this, then that will happen. And then she won't be able to do that. And then ultimately she'll have a bad life. When you get through that whole spiral of, if my kid doesn't turn in her homework, she'll get a bad grade. And then she won't be able to get into college. And then she'll just have to, be on unemployment or something like, you know what I'm saying? And I think that this spiraling is something that we also need to take responsibility for trying to stop in our own brains and to role model, the here and now. So I try to, it can be hard, but I do try to sit down with my children and talk over something that is happening with them if they're willing, and using that here and now present moment focus. We're not going to worry about what happened last week when I got annoyed that you never did the dishes. We're not going to worry about next week when you have that big final exam. We're going to worry about right this minute, the here and now, and maybe that can help us get to a good place.
Next up is Mike. Mike, go ahead.
Hi. You kind of answered a lot of questions on books, which was my original question too. Drilling down a little bit in that, in terms of self-actualization, there are 3 books that I'm familiar with that vary from very permissive to micromanage. And one of them is, of course, the Dr. Spock book, which is not the Spock of Star Trek, but a different Spock, versus Amy Chua versus Charles Dobson. Amy Chua wrote a book, Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mom, which was very self-actualization, but austere and micromanaged. Do you have any thoughts toward writing your book, which I eagerly await, although by the time it's out, no, I shouldn't say it that way. I'll be worrying about grandchildren rather than children, because I have a lot of projects like that. Do you think that, where do you come down on the I like self-actualization, which is what I got out of Stoic, but I wonder about micromanage.
Well, I go back to the concept of the self-driven child and autonomy. Teaching our kids to become more autonomous in a healthy way. Definitely the Tiger Mom has made a big splash in recent years. I do think there's also a backlash against it as well. And I like to see that backlash, but it's funny, one of my coworkers, his son is a junior in high school, and the son literally turned to his dad and said, "Why weren't you and mom tiger parents?" Because he's applying to college and he's really upset that he didn't, do enough activities on his resume. It's like, I wish you'd been tiger parents, and that's, I've had moments like that with my kids too, where they look at other peers where, why, she's been playing violin since she was 3. She's so accomplished now. Well, we asked you if you want to play violin, you tried it, you didn't like it, and oh well, that's how it is. I think there's also, always sort of a compromise, because you do want to provide that guidance and you do want to have boundaries. I mean, I do, this is not really in the Stoic talk, but I think that kids do need boundaries. They need a sense of definition. I think for me, a lot of these ethical principles actually provide that. I mean, the simple golden rule is setting up a lot of boundaries, because, you can't just take everything for yourself and keep it all, and you can't just abuse other people. That's a very simple starting place. But yeah, I think that I would like to do more thinking about this and more writing about this. So thanks for the encouragement.
Thank you, Meredith. Next up, last three questions from Zeno, Justin, and Phil. Zeno, go ahead.
Yeah, hi. This is beautiful. Thank you so much. I hope that this can have some influence on schools and education. I remember when emotional intelligence came out and Goldman's book, schools picked this up and they started developing some curriculum around this. My question actually is about your background. I see that 4 women, maybe muses, maybe virtues, maybe goddesses. Why did you choose that? Can you explain that a bit?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for asking. This is taken from a Roman marble that I saw at the North Carolina Museum of Art when I was actually over there, maybe about a year and a half ago. And I don't know a huge amount about it, but I think it was actually part of someone's coffin, a grave. And I just like the fact that it's kind of these women coming together to talk about something that matters to them. And to me, it represents, you know, and for me, the Stoic Mom blog is really about sharing with other moms and dads, sharing with people who want to come together and have this conversation, even if it's online. So that's why I chose this.
Yeah, thanks.
Last question is by Justin. Justin, go ahead. Justin, are you there? You need to unmute yourself. Okay, doesn't look like. So I think, Meredith, I'm very, very impressed because, I mean, it's actually the field, like just like the pandemic, right? See, Stoicism has been gaining popularity because people are finding it, have been finding it useful. When the pandemic hit, people realized that, wow, this philosophy, because I have it, it is enabling me to deal with this situation better, a little better than people around me. And it looks like parenting is a field like that because it's like, it's not exactly a pandemic, but it's a radical change in your life and a radical change in what is within your power and what is not within your power. And also you care about certain results in this other being, which is this little being just trying to kind of develop. So I think it's a wonderful, wonderful field, wonderful application. So I'm very delighted about that you're writing the book. And, you know, all of us, there was lots of comments in the chat about, you know, people waiting for your book. And I would be delighted to have you back here as often as you would like. There are lots of people, and I would be happy to invite more people who are Stoic parents to help you along in whatever way. So thank you very much. Really appreciate it. It was wonderful, wonderful talk. So what we are going to do, folks, is that as usual, we are going to now break up into small 6 to 8 person rooms so we can discuss these ideas, and then we'll come back into the main room in 25 minutes and we'll be discussing our takeaways from it. Okay, and I'm really looking forward to that. So I'm just opening up the breakout room. So Meredith, if you have any last words here, go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your interest. I welcome you to go to thestoicmom.com. It's a blog where I write about this. And you can also, if you'd like, follow me on Twitter at The Stoic Woman, where I tweet periodically. And again, just thank you so much. Your questions are really interesting and it helps me kind of formulate what I hope to do next.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I'm going to open the breakout rooms now.